Xtalks connects professionals in the life science, medical device, and food industries with useful content like webinars, job openings, articles, and virtual meetings to help you succeed in your career. This food industry-focused podcast brings together some of our editorial staff to share insights into the latest B2B industry news to help keep you up to date.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com, and this week I'm delighted to introduce our special guests on the show. We have with us today Dr. Jeremy Levin, who's the CEO and Chairman of Ovid Therapeutics, and Meg Alexander, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Ovid. Ovid Therapeutics is a biopharmaceutical company focused on developing novel medicines for epilepsies and seizure-related disorders. This is of great significance as nearly 50 million people across the world live with epilepsies and seizures. Approximately half of these patients take 5 or more medicines, yet they still experience seizures. And many current anti-seizure medications have side effects that can diminish overall quality of life. Along with serving as chairman and CEO of Ovid Therapeutics, Dr. Levin is also the chairman of Othea. And prior to founding Ovid, Dr. Levin was president and CEO of Teva Pharmaceutical Industries. Prior to that, Dr. Levin was a member of the executive committee at Bristol-Myers Squibb Company, where he was the architect, lead, and implementer of the String of Pearls strategy, which transformed BMS and facilitated the initiation and massive growth of the immuno-oncology revolution in the biopharmaceutical industry. Dr. Levin also serves on the board and executive committee of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO, as the immediate past chairman. Dr. Levin was voted as one of the 25 most influential biotechnology leaders by Fierce Biotech, one of the top 3 biotechnology CEOs by the Healthcare Technology Report, and one of the PharmaVoice100 CEOs in 2020 and 2021. He was selected by Endpoints in 2021 as one of the 60 living pioneers of the industry. And he's also received numerous awards throughout his career. Dr. Levin has practiced medicine at university hospitals in England, South Africa, and Switzerland. It's also a pleasure for me to introduce Meg Alexander, who serves as Ovid's Chief Strategy Officer, a role in which she oversees and supports the company's corporate strategy and planning, performance measurement, and risk mitigation. She also oversees the company's corporate affairs function with a focus on engaging Ovid's stakeholders across patient and caregiver communities, policymakers, press, and investors. Ms. Alexander has worked in the biopharmaceutical industry for 2 decades and has played a key role in launching more than 25 new medicines for many conditions, including rare epilepsies, ALS, HIV, multiple sclerosis, Batten's disease, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. She has advised and led campaigns for large healthcare organizations, including Pfizer, Novartis, Amgen, Eli Lilly, Nestle, and Coca-Cola, among others. Prior to Ovid, she founded and led the Reputation and Risk Management Group, a consultancy within Syneos Health, one of the world's largest clinical research organizations. Ms. Alexander was named a disruptor and a rising star in her industry by PM360 and the Healthcare Business Women's Association, respectively. This year, Ovid is expecting several CNS data readouts, including one for its lead product candidate, soticlestat, which is currently in phase 3 trials for the treatment of refractory seizures in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome, which is a rare epilepsy with high unmet need. So without further ado, to learn more about Ovid Therapeutics and its therapeutic programs, let's turn to Dr. Levin and Ms. Alexander. Thank you so much to the both of you for being on this show today.
Ayesha, thank you very much for having us.
Our pleasure.
So I'd like to start off by asking Dr. Levin, as the CEO and chairman of Ovid Therapeutics, could you tell us more about the company and its core missions and goals? And then before we get into some of the other topics we have.
Ayesha, the core mission of Ovid is to treat untreatable or previously untreatable disorders of the brain. the goal of the company is to take advantage of an immense revolution happening in neurology and neurosciences today, and to be at the cutting edge of new important medicines. We've chosen a number of areas. We've built a very, very differentiated pipeline, and with some good fortune, we'll make a significant change to the lives for the better of millions of patients around the world. So that's what we're about, changing the lives of patients with intractable disorders of the brain.
And can you specifically tell us a bit more about epilepsies associated with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome, which are the indications that you're pursuing your lead therapeutic development in, and what are the unmet needs in these conditions?
Epilepsy, Ayesha, is one of the oldest described disorders in mankind, and yet we've not cured it. Over the last 60 years, some 30 different medicines have been developed. And no matter what we've done, no matter how many medicines we produce, patients still are unable to grapple with and conquer their seizures. Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet belong to a particularly intractable part of the panoply of different disorders that lead to seizures. They're complex, they're intractable, and often you have patients who are taking between 4 to 5 to 6 different medicines, and yet they break through. Each of these disorders are labeled, because of this particular subset, as a developmental epileptic encephalopathy. Long words, but simple outcome, a disastrous medical condition. And while new drugs are coming along, it's only in the last 5 years that we finally start to see this disorder starting to be cracked open. And we believe that one of the medicines that we're developing, and it's only one of several, called soticlestat, will make a profound impact on these patients. We certainly hope that, and our early clinical trial results indicate that that's likely.
And could you elaborate on the innovative approaches, or the approaches in general, that Ovid Therapeutics is leading and taking the research and development of treatments for these conditions?
Yes. Over the last 10 years, Ayesha, there's been a revolution in the neurosciences. New ways of selecting targets, which are proteins in the brain that you can tackle and maybe can change the course of a disease, new ways of understanding the genetics of a disease, new ways of actually taking an image of the brain, picturing exactly how the drug actually interacts with the protein in the brain, how much of it is required to change the function of that protein. So Ovid's been studying these and knows a lot about how these new methodologies have taken a real change for the positive in the last 10 years. And in doing that, we've carefully selected the kinds of targets that we believe are fundamental to making a change in epilepsies and seizure-related disorders. These targets are not easy to find. There are many people who have followed the same targets for many, 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 many years. Now, with the new technologies, we have multiple targets in Dravet, in Lennox-Gastaut. Underlying those particular disorders are many different ways that impact and cause the disease to be severe. But we believe that the target that we've selected, called cholesterol 24-hydroxylase, is a very special enzyme that could, by modulating it, have a profound effect on the disease. That enzyme, which has never before been tackled, is one which metabolizes the cholesterol locked up in the nerves of the brain. And by doing that, by actually metabolizing it, it generates in epilepsy and seizures a very toxic molecule called 24-hydroxycholesterol. That particular molecule permeates through the brain and causes two effects. One, it causes a very particular effect on a kind of behavior of the cell called the glutamate pathway. It exacerbates it, and glutamate, when exacerbated, causes seizures. That's one thing it does. On the other side of that is it causes inflammation. So you not only cause seizures, but you cause a really terrible mechanism which could destroy and does destroy brain cells. So if you stop that, if you cut it off by inhibiting 24-hydroxycholesterol, by inhibiting the amounts of 24-hydroxycholesterol being produced, you can immediately stop seizures and inflammation. And that's what soticlestat does. And that's why we were so interested in it.
And so, are there various subsets of patients that express higher than normal? In the conditions, I'm assuming there are higher than normal levels of this compound 24-HC. And so, are there subsets of patients that have higher levels than others? And is there heterogeneity within that?
We don't know the full extent and the full biology of this very powerful molecule. What we do know is when soticlestat inhibits the enzyme, you can see a dose-related reduction in the amount of this 24-HC that is produced. It's direct, measurable, and it's measurable because 24-HC goes out of the brain into the bloodstream, and you can measure it. So by measuring the amount in the bloodstream, you get a jolly good idea of how much of that enzyme, cholesterol 24-hydroxylase, you're inhibiting. But as of now, it's very difficult to say, is there one subset or another? As far as we can see, to the best of our knowledge, it's a common mechanism seen across all of these patients with both Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet. And by the way, I would also say that we've seen effects, very powerful effects, on CDKL5, another intractable developmental epileptic encephalopathy.
And Meg, I'd like to turn to you and ask, as the Chief Strategy Officer, Ovid Therapeutics has decided to really concentrate on what is called bold science, which I was reading about, and again, how Dr. Levin mentioned, exploring novel therapeutic targets in the CNS arena instead of following more conventional paths. And so could you tell me more about that strategy and how, and the challenges associated with leading this kind of a sort of groundbreaking and unconventional approach?
Well, thank you for acknowledging that, Ayesha. So there's really two elements when we think about this. There's a purpose-driven element of this, and there's a business-driven element of our strategy. We do pursue bold science. We do pursue novel mechanisms. And there's a reason for that when you think about the patients that we seek to serve, those ones that Jeremy was describing to you before. When you think about what these patients have experienced, while epilepsy has been known for literally millennia, to Jeremy's earlier point, and there are medicines out there, the medicines that have come to the fore in the last several decades have been incremental innovation. And that's important. It's important to improve the modest things that we can improve. But these are families, they're adults, they're children who really deserve a step change. So not just better medicines and friendlier medicines that are easier to take, but ones that truly address the panoply of challenges that these families and these people are dealing with. So in Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet, like Jeremy described to you about a moment ago, 90% of those patients are not adequately controlled with the seizure medicines that are out there today. And to paint a picture of what this looks like, these are parents who oftentimes sleep with their children all night long because they're worried they're going to die in the night from a seizure. These are really, really sick people. And despite taking 3, 4, 5 medicines, they're still having those breakthrough seizures that Jeremy mentioned. So when you think about that, and you look at all the medicines that have been created, a lot of what we've seen in the last couple decades have been improvements, and improvement is good. That's significant, but it hasn't been a step change. And when you think about what these families deal with, they deserve a step change. So from the purpose perspective, we're looking at new approaches, right? We're looking at new biological targets, unique mechanisms of action that can work differently, but at the same time work with all these other medicines that these patients already have on board, because they're taking many, many medicines, as you said at the top of this piece. From a business perspective, it's also smart. So beyond the purpose of us wanting to improve the lives of these individuals and these families who so need it, on this flip side of it, from the business perspective, we don't want to be in a category where 4 or 5 other people already have medicines that are going to be coming before us. So I don't want to be the next best person that's just a little bit better than the last medicine in a category that already has 5, 6, 7 medicines in there. And there's certain target receptor areas that are becoming very, very crowded that way. What is exciting to us, but also a challenge, to your point, Ayesha, is to really look at novel mechanisms that can make a huge difference for these families and these patients, but can also unlock incredible scientific and medical opportunity. What you said is it's challenging. It's true, because we're having to pave a path where others haven't done so before. But that's also exhilarating. And when you do it right, you can get something like seizure-related, like Jeremy referenced, that can be what I believe will be a very significant impact for these families and these populations.
Thank you so much, Meg, for that overview of the strategic aspect. And speaking a bit more about seizure-related, it's currently in phase 3 trials. And so what can we expect, and what kind of readouts are you expecting to share, I know, pretty soon? So I'd love to hear more about those trials and the results that you're expecting to see.
Sure, I'll start, but I welcome my colleague Jeremy to chime as well. So we're expecting 2 global pivotal phase 3 readouts before the end of September of this year. So it's coming really soon, and we're really excited for patients. And it is by far, in a way, the largest and most rigorous clinical development program that's ever been done in these conditions. So that gives us a lot of conviction behind the results. And when you ask, Ayesha, so what do we expect to see? So what we expect to see, I think, will be really exciting, not just for us, but again, for those families that you're hearing us talk about. So we believe that seizure-related in both Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet will deliver really significant seizure reduction. We've actually had longer-term open-label extension studies running through our partner, Takeda, who's picked up the programs over the course of the last couple of years. And we've seen pretty profound results. We've seen very significant seizure reduction in the endpoints that are the seizure types that are the primary endpoints in the trials. So those are major motor drop seizures in Lennox-Gastaut, and their convulsive seizures in people who have Dravet. But importantly, we've seen this go out over 2 years. So in 3 different epilepsy types, we have more than 2 years of data at 108 weeks, where we're seeing profound seizure reduction that's sustained. That actually doesn't happen a lot in this field. It's kind of like a grand slam, because unfortunately what happens, many of these patients take a medicine, and then a year, 2 years in, the medicine starts to not be as effective anymore at reducing the seizures. So that's one thing we expect to see. The other thing we expect to see, because we have years upon years upon years of very rigorous data at this point, that the safety profile has findings that are almost akin to placebo. That's also really exceptional in this field, because a lot of these medicines have major tolerability issues. They put you to sleep, they impact your appetite. So that's a big deal. And we've also seen that we can layer it into regimens where patients are already taking other anti-seizure medicines, and it doesn't have any side effects. So that trifecta is a really big deal in this space. And you heard me say the word friendlier, effective medicines earlier. That's really important. These are families that have a lot to deal with, and having a medicine that works, but that's friendly to add into, the polypharmacy regimens, that doesn't require a lot of tests and monitoring, is really significant for them. And it's our hope that over time, that will also contribute to other things that are really important to these families, such as behavioral, communications, mobility implications that happen by having seizure after seizure after seizure that creates damage to the brain and to the body that's hard to repair over time. So we believe and hope that over time we may be even able to see impacts there as well. That gives you a preview of what we're hoping to see in a few months.
Ayesha, it's also important to go back to a step change that Meg used. If you don't think about new medicines in that fashion, you'll never progress. This happened when in 2006 and 2007, when the world thought about oncology, about poisoning, killing cells, when suddenly the step change was to ask the question, could you galvanize the white cells to tackle cancers? And from that, suddenly the world of opportunity opened up. And literally millions of years of patients' lives have been extended and cancers are being cured. Here with soticlestat, you're opening up a new area, a target never before seen, one actually which people probably didn't want to tackle because it looked difficult. But now, every piece of information that we've got from this, from the preclinical through to the animal models, through to the phase 1, the 1B, 2A, the phase 2, and now into this pivotal trial and this long period of time that these patients have been on these drugs, everything is consistent. So what Meg described is a moment where you're seeing a potentially break open moment in epilepsy, a new potential drug that could, if it's successful, change the way that we think about the kind of target we go after. Just like in years gone by, when you looked at that cancer cell and you said, boy, you just got to kill it. Now you ask the question, could you get the body to learn to kill it? Here you have a way of looking at a completely new enzyme, one that's metabolizing that cholesterol in the brain, which you would never expect to be one of the root causes of a disorder. But as we do this and we unpack the metabolism of the brain, how it works, not just could cholesterol be a target, but there may be others. So I think one needs to think about several things here. One, the data is consistent from the preclinical. Two, you learn a lot from a trial like this, where you've opened up a new possibility on a completely new area. Consider this. We're now looking at how the brain metabolizes cholesterol to impact seizures. Very unusual. And more than that, as Meg says, if we're able to stop, and we believe we possibly could be, because we could see it in animals, stop the death of cells caused by this 24HC, then maybe you'll see not just changes in behavior caused by reductions in seizures, but maybe, just maybe, you're heading down the path of where you have a situation that you've removed a toxin from the brain and cells can live and heal. So I really think this is a paradigm shift in thinking. It's not just another medicine.
And you're absolutely right how you described the revolution of sorts that we've seen in oncology towards more targeted and personalized therapies, and to really target the biology and pathophysiology of the disease. And we're seeing the same in other spaces like the CNS space. So absolutely, everybody talks about all of the learnings from oncology, and it's wonderful to see them being translated and adopted in other areas. And like you said, who would have thought targeting a cholesterol pathway in the brain may be able to answer some of these questions around epilepsies. So that's really wonderful to learn about. And also, I just wanted to ask whether soticlestat is being evaluated as solely a monotherapy, or are there also is there scope for them to be used in conjunction with other therapies? I think, Meg, you mentioned that they could be. I'm just wondering if that's being looked at in trials as well.
So you asked the right question. So I think the first piece, Ayesha, is we're looking at it, Takeda's looking at it as an adjunctive therapy now by itself. For patients, though, almost all of these refractory epilepsy patients are on polypharmacy, so many medicines. So where you're starting to go is actually a strategic insight into our pipeline and our approach by virtue of us pursuing novel mechanisms of action in seizures and epilepsies, and by pursuing molecules that have exceptionally good safe and tolerability profiles. What we can look at is not just can they be friendly to be able to add to a polypharmacy regimen, but also over time, could they be combination therapies with some of the other novel mechanisms of action that we have in our pipeline? And that's very much what we're thinking right now. And there should be opportunity across pretty much all of our pipeline, whether you're looking at soticlestat as a cholesterol 24-hydroxylase inhibitor, or Ovid 329 program, which is a GABA aminotransferase inhibitor that works on the inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, or KCC2, which is the earliest part of our pipeline and is a really exciting target that essentially directly activates the potassium chloride cotransporter 2. So you're asking the right question. These can be used in combination therapies, we believe. That's probably the next step after you start to look at them as individual therapies in polypharmacy regimens.
And also, I wanted to ask about resistance. You mentioned that with current therapies, resistance is an issue. And so how does something like soticlestat potentially overcome that? And you did mention the durability that you've seen of the compound in trials already. So does that give you hope that this can be an answer to resistance as well?
Well, perhaps I'll take a crack at that. Resistance comes from not understanding the mechanism behind the disorder. And for many years, for all the time that we've known about epilepsy, up until recent times, we've not been able to unpack why, after a time, a medicine no longer works. So today, as we start to look at soticlestat, we're actually tackling the underlying causes of those seizures. Seizures are the outcome of a process. They're not the disease. They are simply the expression of something going wrong. And so in order to deal with what you've said, which is terribly important, because as Meg says, most people will break through their therapy. This is a very unfortunate fact, but we believe that some of the root causes of that are inflammation. Some of them are abnormal functioning of the excitability of the outside of the cell, and that's why we're interested in our potassium chloride channel 2. These are co-transporters. They control the excitability of the cell. That could be a very important mechanism. And if we're able to control not just the metabolism of cholesterol and its effects on inflammation, but also the excitability of the cell, then you have something which can actually start to really overcome some of the core mechanisms that are responsible for this resistance and breakthrough. It's a very unfortunate fact. However, you should know that in all major diseases, there is an element of this. For example, in cancer, the cancer cells become resistant. You have to understand why they become resistant, how they overcome it. And if you have a targeted therapy like Gleevec, you can overcome it. Now, for years, the non-targeted drugs didn't deal with that targeted approach. Same thing in epilepsy. Never allowed, you could stop the disease for a while and then it came back. Now you have the targeted therapies. And with a little bit of luck, as we unpack these mechanisms, we'll be able to push back and prevent the kinds of things that have been the norm, the breakthrough, the next drug, the next moment where you have to put another drug on for that patient and making their lives so difficult. The more drugs they have, the more difficult it is. But the more you understand the mechanism underlying the disorder, the more you're likely to be able to stop that.
And Absolutely. I mean, you're talking about disruptive therapeutics here potentially. And I'd like to actually learn more about how you arrive or how you evolve into that kind of a disruptive mindset. Both of you as leaders in this space, Dr. Levin, with your illustrious career in leading biotech and revolutionizing the industry, essentially. So, how do you develop that kind of a disruptive mindset? How do you get to that? And how do you convince others? Because it's so easy to fall into conventional and traditional approaches just because they're tried, tested, they work somewhat, they're comfortable. How have you done what you've done, essentially?
I think the light went on in my mind many years ago when two things occurred. The first was the realization as a doctor that every time you give a medicine to a patient, you change their life. Every time. And you therefore must understand that the medicine you're going to give them is going to be the best and the best and the best. The second was to understand one of the first medicines I ever worked with was the bold idea that you could take the venom of a snake and turn it into a medicine that controlled blood pressure. This, to my mind, was remarkable. Here, a scientist saw that when a snake bit a person, their blood pressure dropped. And they unpacked that whole mechanism. That led to one of the greatest drugs that has ever been used in hypertension called captopril. So those two things, learn from the biology and go where others don't dare to go, is the way to create great medicines. The same thing applied again more recently when we went after Medarex to secure the first ever drugs that could ignite a T-cell response against a cancer. Remember, it's all very common now, but in 2007, it was an area where it was regarded as being ridiculous to get into. Companies were getting out of it and never wanted anything to do with it. And scientists were trying to prove that there was a real opportunity here. And those like Niels Lonsberg, who really understood the effect of a revolutionary idea, said, no, we've got to go forward with this. And once you understood that, a bold idea, just like captopril snake venom turns into controlling blood pressure, so too, you change the whole paradigm. And unless you do that, while you can do good, you can do many things good, you can change lives, you can improve them incrementally. You can't do what Meg said. You can't make that step change. Step change comes from following science and doing something very bold, and then the rewards that come with that are disproportionate, and that's what you want to do. You want reward clinically, which is disproportionate, not just a little bit, and you want financial reward for your shareholders, which is equally disproportionate. And oh, by the way, Genentech is an exact example of that. Genentech was a few cents share before it discovered its first drug that nobody ever believed it could discover. And it went from a few cents to $70. And it helped profoundly cure disorders. So I think this is a story told throughout biotech's history. If you are bold and you go ahead and you do it sensibly and thoughtfully, you have a great opportunity to be successful. So my logic is not one on emotion. It's not one that I came to through anything other than seeing it work again and again and again. Meg, I don't know what your thoughts are, but that's where I come from.
Well, I concur with you on following the science. So we're very like-minded. I would say in complement to what Jeremy and the leadership that he's brought beyond Ovid, but to our field and following the science and the types of medicines that's unlocked. I think when you think about being disruptive, I would use the word having comfort of doing things differently. Disruptive is maybe the output of what we do, but we've embraced as an entire team here, Jeremy, myself, but also our colleagues who aren't on this podcast today, a comfort with being different. So most companies of our size have one program, one product that they're trying to do one thing with. Our ambitions are bigger than that, right? We see the opportunity in the science and the mechanisms we're pursuing, and we're going to let that unfold, and we're racing it to be able to bring the therapeutic value. So part of that is, if you look at us from the outside, we actually have more of a mid-cap company size pipeline and a small cap company, but we believe we can realize that opportunity nimbly. I think other things that we're comfortable with is it doesn't need to be invented here to find something great. So we have people who are fantastic deal makers, but we do things differently. We've gone out and we've achieved deals by working with small and large pharmaceutical companies that have allowed us to find those special diamonds in the roughs of mechanisms that can be unlocked for this potential. And that's been a big piece of how we operate. And also just looking to develop differently. We did a deal on one of the most exciting mechanisms of action, I think, that we're going to see in neurology in the next couple of years, which is ROCK2 inhibition for the brain. We could do a whole podcast on that. But we did it in a time when the market was really down and there was no capital being unlocked for anybody, including us. So we did a really innovative deal that allowed two small companies to succeed together and find a way to develop an asset and get into the clinic, and hopefully we'll be in humans later this year. So you just have to look at doing things differently and not be wed to what should be the traditional archetype for a company of my size or for a market cap of my size, because you're inherently capitating your ambitions that way, and thereby capitating the medical progress that we could otherwise achieve.
And I think you mentioned the approach where you partner with other biotechs, and that's obviously a very common approach now, but perhaps in the past, which wasn't so much. We're also seeing engagement with a lot of different stakeholders, patients themselves, their caregivers, patient advocacy groups, academia, government. So how has the landscape kind of changed in CNS drug development, and I guess in drug development in general, in the biotech space, with all of these different stakeholders now being brought to the same table?
Very important question. This question goes to the core of what modern and future drug discovery, development, and delivery of medicines requires. There are multiple stakeholders. Each company needs to appreciate the role that each plays in that. For example, if we don't understand the payers, there's no way of getting a medicine to them. And you better understand on day one that your medicine will need a payer. And therefore, how are you going to, even if you find it, what are you going to do with it? Going further than that, patients, we're all patients, have much to contribute. Every single one of us who has a disorder understands it intimately or tries to understand it intimately. The value of what you gain from that as a company trying to find medicines is that you have real life experience. Now, if you have a community who can share their experiences, and those communities have now built the digital platforms that abound, provide them the forum and the creativity to understand and to link together their experiences, and something that previously was a lonely moment, a pain in the shoulder, a cough, whatever, is now understood to be part of a syndrome around a disease. So you get a much more holistic picture by linking with the families of what that disease means to them, how much it actually impacts them. Now, why is that important? It's actually important for a number of different items, each one of which is actually commercially important, financially important, medically important. Let me give you an example. If you want to understand what your endpoint is in a disorder, a medically significant change that you're looking to change, you've got to talk to those families because they know. Then you've got to talk to the FDA and bring the families with you. So there you are. You've got two stakeholders that you really have to link together. It's glue. You take one step further than that. If you want to know from those families that they're going to support you, they're going to believe in you. Well, you've got to engage with them. And how does that help you? It helps you in your enrollment. Now, we have a lot of experience on that. For example, in our phase 2 for soticlestat, we had built a deep relationship with the family organizations, and we enrolled 6 months in advance of what we anticipated because the family wanted to be part of this. So that's one stakeholder. The families are one portion of an enormous ecosystem that today each company needs to take account of. Oh, and by the way, don't mistake this for being just families, shareholders, payers. It's not that. You have to understand also the policymakers and what they're responding to, because the legislation that they put in place, the types of tax reimbursement that they can provide you, the types of incentives that they can create for you are dependent upon them understanding the disorder. So in this complex healthcare environment that we live in, that we develop drugs in, you must have a holistic view of what the disease is, what you're trying to accomplish, and those that you're trying to address. And I believe that that's a critical part of every company today, is to understand their stakeholders. And that is what we call within Ovid stakeholder capitalism.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Levin, for that overview. That was very, very insightful, really to understand better the landscape and ecosystem of drug discovery and development and all of the stakeholders involved. So thank you so much for that. And Meg as well, thank you. Moving forward and looking ahead, I'd like to know sort of what are the strategic milestones that Ovid hopes to achieve in the next coming months, of course. In September, looking forward to those pivotal phase 3 trial results. But looking even further ahead, what are some critical milestones that we can expect Ovid to be reaching, and how do you potentially also plan to navigate any challenges or any hiccups that come along on the way?
Well, it's going to be a very big year for Ovid. So beyond those 2 pivotal phase 3 trials, which we're very excited about and that we'll be reading out soon, we actually have 5 other very significant clinical and regulatory milestones for our other programs coming up in the next 12 months. So for one of our first applications of the ROCK2 inhibition program, cerebral cavernous malformations, we'll be starting a patient signal finding trial. That will be really huge, and we think we'll be able to showcase the potential to ameliorate and stabilize what are very significant lesions in the brain. So that's huge. We have 2 other programs in our GABA aminotransferase program that will be going into human trials to be able to help alleviate refractory status epilepticus, which is very, very severe. These are people that are in emergency rooms or IVs who have such refractory seizures that oftentimes they need to be almost completely sedated, put into a coma. So again, very significant. And that KCC2 program that you've heard us refer to, so potassium chloride cotransporter 2, now you know why we say KCC2, a lot easier to get out of the mouth, will be going into also humans within the next year. First time anyone, anywhere has taken a direct activator of KCC2 into people. And that's really important because we think it's going to be significant, not just for seizures and epilepsies, but a lot of neurological conditions, including psychosis, things like schizophrenia, maybe psychosis and Parkinson's. So huge opportunity to unlock truly differentiated medicines with these novel mechanisms of action. So if we're successful in the coming years, hopefully you will see lots of news out of each of these programs because each is very important. But what we're really working to do, Ayesha, is starting with seizures, we're trying to bring balance to the brain of that hyperexcitability that causes seizures. We're trying to alleviate the symptoms that make the lives of these people very, very hard. And if we're successful with some of these mechanisms, we believe that one day we're actually going to halt the disease in its tracks. And that's what we aspire for. And we've got several really exciting mechanisms to help us get there. And in terms of challenges, it's a field that is, laden with risk. There's always challenges, but, the flip side of challenges, there's opportunity. It's all opportunities. The flip side of challenge is opportunity. And, that's what you navigate with drug development, whether it comes from the policy perspective, like what Jeremy alluded to a few minutes ago with, things like the Inflation Reduction Act that our industry, is been starting to absorb and plan for over the course of the last 2 years. We just think about it. It changes the constraints with which you need to solve within, and then you think differently. So it helps us optimize the way that we're thinking about our indication selection and where there's opportunities to develop our medicines globally. There's a lot of countries in addition to the United States where we can go today. So, challenge constraints really, I think, help unlock opportunities. It helps us invent and see things differently. And that's really who Ovid is. And that's the way that we've looked at the field. And thankfully, that's enabled us to be very successful so far. And we'll continue pursuing it.
Ayesha, I think underpinning everything that Meg has said is that you start from a set of values and purpose. Those values and that purpose drive you. Without them, you can never face difficulties and challenges, and you can't see opportunities. We have both that, values and purpose.
What a wonderful way to end off. Dr. Levin and Meg, thank you so much for your time, and I can't appreciate enough the wonderful insights, and I wish you all the best at Ovid, and I'm so excited to see what's in store, and definitely will be keeping an eye out here at Xtalks at all of the wonderful work coming out of Ovid. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Ayesha.
That's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Xtalks Food Industry Podcast. If you enjoyed our discussions today, please share the episode with your friends and colleagues, and be sure to subscribe in order to be notified when a new episode is released. To join in on the discussion, you can find Xtalks on social media. Email podcast@xtalks.com or comment on the articles directly. Links are in the show description. Take a moment to join our community at xtalks.com to get access to everything we have to offer, including webinars, job listings, virtual meetings, articles, and more. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers sharing them. They should not be taken as professional advice and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.